Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Maybe it's still morning for some of us. Thank you for coming today. My name is Michael Kugelman, the South Asia Program Associate for the Wilson Center's Asia Program. The Wilson Center is all about collaborations. We have more than 40 different programs and departments here, and the Asia Program has hosted events together with many of them. But today's event is more of an intra-Asia program collaboration, as we'll be looking at both Japan and India. So I wanted to acknowledge the assistance of my Northeast Asia counterpart, Bryce Wakefield, sitting in the back. Thank you, Bryce. Bryce, as many of you know, is the Wilson Center's Japan expert on staff. In recent years, the broader Asia region has experienced a lot of volatility and change, from new governments to wars and, of course, very tragic events such as earthquakes, floods, tsunamis. One of the few constants in Asia in the geopolitical context has been the deepening relationship between Japan and India. Bilateral ties have been solidifying quietly yet consistently. And I think that the year 2005 marked a series of summits involving the two countries, and since then things have really taken off. A strategic agreement in 2007, followed by a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, and also preliminary talks on a potential civil nuclear accord. And the intensification of economic ties is particularly striking. Since 2004-2005, India has been the largest recipient of Japan's official development assistance. So this is a very fast-growing relationship, though it's often forgotten amid all the discussion about China's rise, India's rise, India-Pakistan ties, events on the Korean Peninsula, etc. So today we look forward to shedding some light on the India-Japan relationship, and we're very fortunate to have distinguished speakers from both India and Japan to offer their perspectives, as well as a perspective from Washington. So we'll be hearing the three speakers consecutively, and after we hear from them, we'll go to a Q&A. We're first going to hear from Takanori Horimoto, who is a professor of contemporary South Asian politics at Shobi University. He's a specialist on South Asian politics and U.S. South Asian policy. He's authored a number of publications, including India as a Rising Military Power, which he co-edited in 2010. And earlier this year, he published a report that some of you may have seen in the East-West Center. It's called the Japan-India Nuclear Agreement, Enhancing Bilateral Agreement. After him, we'll be hearing from Professor K.V. Kesavan, who's a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He served on the faculty of the Center for East Asian Studies at the School of International Studies at JNU in New Delhi. It was for more than 30 years, and he's held visiting fellowship and professor positions at institutions in the U.S. and in Asia. He's also the author of numerous publications on Japan. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Daniel Twining, who is the Senior Fellow for Asia at the German Marshall Fund of the U.S. He previously served as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. He advised Senator John McCain on foreign policy, and he was also a staff member for the U.S. Trade Representative. So with that, I will defer to the speakers and defer to Professor Horimoto.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm very pleased to be here. And then today my main mission is just make a picture of what is a sort of bird-eye view of the bilateral relationship. And needed to say that other factors, other countries are coming in. And main argument is this one. The first portion is present bilateral relationship is the best one in the past 6 decades. And of course, during 1950s, there was a good period was there, but it was mainly due to the Prime Minister Nehru's sort of attractiveness and so on. And there is no structural sort of basement on that. But this time, in this period, especially since 1990s onward, the relationship has been gradually matured. And then now this, I go in detail later, but now this present relation could be called the closest one in the past 6 decades. And in order to understand clearly about the second phase and first phase, I just make a brief summary of the first phase, and then going into the second phase, 1990s onward. And then this 1990s onward, as written here, there are two sub-periods. And then mainly, basic tone is dovetailing to perception, interest, and common concerns of maritime security in the ocean. And now, this is a development in the 1950s to 1980s. During this period, put it very simple way, is a kind of mutual incompatibility. For example, foreign relations, the reflection of the Cold War period. And the Japan is the Japan-US alliance system. Whereas in India's case, the first three, 1950s to 1960s, so-called non-alignment has been pursued. And then 1970s and 1980s, and India is in fact in the Soviet alliance. And the economy also, India has been using this free economy, whereas India is a kind of closed economy. In such a way, both of the countries could not see eye to eye. And this has been reflected for the infrequent interactions. For example, prime ministers. From Japan to India, Ikeda was the last prime minister in 1960s, and then Nakasone, the second prime minister, go to India, and gap of roughly 2 decades. And India to Japan also, Mrs. Indira Gandhi came 1969, and after that, 10 years later. In such a way, it's a kind of mutual incompatibilities has made infrequent interactions between the two countries. And what happened is 1990s onward. 2 phases, as I said. First phase is 1990s, and second phase is 2000 onward. And then this is picked up from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. The 1990s, the VIP visit from Japan to India and India to Japan is total 27. Whereas in 2000 onward, the VIPs visiting mutually is roughly same as 1 decade, 27. And what happened was in 2005 to 2009, suddenly it becomes 61, triple. This will show this, rapid sort of dovetailing interest and everything in both of the countries. And now I return to the first phase, the mutually conducive circumstances, no more Soviet Union, acceptability of the United States, especially for India, and India's economic liberalization. And Japan's case, especially for Japan, new market is very fascinating, new partner is very good, and Indian Ocean is very, very sort of sensitive issue, and China policy is gradually coming up. But negative side was atomic explosion in 1998. And probably India's case towards Japan is almost identical. New market, investment from Japan, new partners, China policies. But during this period, 1990s, Japan was only a major foreign option for India. At least every twice or thrice a year, I go to New Delhi and meeting various people, political leaders and so on. And I got the impression that when I, for example, he is a dignitary, and I met him, I just want to discuss something. Then he doesn't show any kind of interest towards Japan. And then this kind of things has been gradually changing. And then now the 1990s is going to finish. And in that sense, it's what I call it capture phase. It's a kind of formative period. And then this is a sort of representing 1990s. Now, the second phase and present phase is started 2000 onward. The Packer phase, as I written here, almost every aspect, both interests, concerns, dovetail, and win-win bilateral relations has been gradually emerging. And what I mean to say is, the almost means except climate change. Climate change is the biggest issue. And then on this issue, two countries could not agree on that, how proceed with it. And then the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh also underscored the importance of relations with United States, China, Japan, and India. In his independence speech, he always made, Indian Prime Minister made the independence speech August 15th on the Red Fort. And it's a kind of anniversary sort of phenomena. And in this independence speech, he made twice, said 4 countries is a very important countries for India. And in this also, Japan has been included. And then particularly, what is the sort of overlapping interest is economy, security, China, 2 oceans, needless to say, SROC, and energy, and Asian regional framework. But slightly different perception toward the United States. And first phase is this is one statement by see this bottom of this slide. One Indian speaker at the first India-Japan Maritime Security Dialogue held in Tokyo last month, and I was representing Japan. And then he said, India is acutely conscious of its position as the weakest among the major powers, and its vulnerability to the shifting alignment between Washington and Beijing. At the same time, Delhi is deeply aware of an expanding strategic gap with China and the need for partners in its internal, external balancing against China. I never see such kind of frank exposition of the opinions by the Indian political thinkers, political strategists. And generally speaking, Professor Keshavana is a very, very, what shall I say, very frank and very good friend for me. Not friend, actually he's a guru for me.
Oh.
And then, but usually say Indian people is very sort of, try to hide or try to not to disclose its real intention, weak side of that. In that sense, this statement showing clearly the present India's political sort of perceptions toward China, India, toward China, United States, Japan, and so on. Just see the how it developed. Chronology of bilateral relations. The 2001 onward, foreign defense. Before 2001, there was Prime Minister's visit 2000 August, and 2000 August means 2000 March. There was a visit by President Clinton, and then 2001 onward, gradually, this bilateral relations has been moved up. And then firstly, the foreign defense director general level meeting has been started. And 2005, biannual each prime minister visit has been started. Anyway, 2005 is a watershed. And 2006, strategic partnership. And 2008, joint statement on security and cooperation. And 2010 onwards, 2+2 meeting of secretary level. This is defense and foreign affairs. And then finally, this year, the August of this year, the comprehensive economic partnership agreement has been put into effect. And moreover, probably within this year, end of this month, the last part of this month, director general level meeting among the United States, India, Japan, and India is going to be held. Formerly, it was proposed that the foreign ministers level trilateral meeting should be held, but it has been downgraded. Needless to say, there is 3 countries are rather very hesitant to somehow against China. Why 2005? Put it very simple way, Japan's effort to diversify. You see this chronology. Japan has been the top recipient of Japan's ODA 2003 onward. And then what happened was next year, China has become Japan's biggest trading partner. And China's rapid emergence in terms of economy and defense. And after that, there occurred this one. There occurred fierce anti-Japanese upheavals in China. All these Japanese restaurants, shops, and markets, everything has been damaged by the Chinese demonstrators. And this makes the Japanese in necessity realized to diversify its foreign relations. Of course, United States is a major one, but besides that, there should be some kind of the sort of partnership will be required. So in that sense, this diversification is a kind of turning point in the year of 2005. And then diversification and multilateral approach. And Japan's motivation to go with India. Probably India has identical and perceptions and approach. And one more. And India is similarly taking a multilateral approach. India's strategic partnership diplomacy. As it may be surprising, at the moment, India is the number one country in the world introducing strategic partnership with 20 countries. And second largest one was China, 12 countries. In case of Japan, 5 or 6. There is no. I repeatedly asked Ministry of Foreign Affairs how many countries Japan is concluding the strategic partnership. There's no statistics. I was amazed at that. And then finally, this one is very important, mutually safeguard. For Japan and for India, this both countries is not risky card, very safety card. In that sense, both mutually, we feel, kind of sense of security is there. And then what happened next is Japan-India economic relations. And Professor Keshavan is going to make more specifically about this point. I'll skip this. I'll just summary of that. And then Japan's cooperation in India's expansion of infrastructure and the nuclear cooperation agreement. And the Japanese government has decided actually to proceed with the nuclear agreement with India. And the Prime Minister Noda is going to India probably middle of next month. And during that time, the biggest one would be this nuclear agreement. Since last November, this talk has been suspended. But by Noda is going to India, New Delhi, and there will be some kind of announcement. Both of the country will resume its nuclear agreement talk. And then second one is security and strategic and security relations. And then probably economy comes, then security. As you may be knowing, there was a quadrilateral approach, 2005 onward, and especially about President Bush, Howard, Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi. They made up a sort of determined effort to make a kind of quadrilateral approach. And this has been criticized by China, severely criticized by China. And then so-called three prime minister presidents, including, they are rather conservatives. So these three people has been retired. So in that sense, this quadrilateral approach has short-lived. And what has happened was, these two quadrilateral approach has been transformed into bilateral setup. In reality, it is still going, but it tried to avoid the appearance of the quadrilateral approach. The one is Indo-US Defense Agreement, Indo-Australia Defense Memorandum of Understanding, Joint Declaration of Security Cooperation, Japan-India Joint Declaration of Security Cooperation. Japan has never made such kind of the security cooperation agreement, declaration with other countries. And then this one, new mechanism of maritime security of South China Sea to be proposed, probably end of this Saturday, Friday or Saturday, that Asian Summit is going to be held. And Prime Minister Noda will make public the new idea about security of sea. And then I'm not very frankly speaking China specialist, and I cannot read Chinese. But by collecting Chinese information through the English medias and Japanese medias, there's lots of the interesting talks. One is this one. The U.S. encourages neighboring countries to go against China, appeared in QC. And this is in Chinese originally and has been translated into English as how China deals with China strategy to contain China. And then another one, China's countermeasure, especially maritime policies. The plan, People's Liberation Army Navy, the expansion, necklace of pearl, Iceland of chain strategy, vast claim for territorial water and Iceland. And China looks to aspire to establish a hierarchical power structure, power order, first in Asia and then in the rest of the world. And I had very interesting Chinese popular proverb, that is, in one mountain, no two tigers are required. And then to cope with this situation, Japan, India's convergence of ocean strategy is very apparent. How to cope with China, which is metamorphosing into sea power, and East Asia becomes a new main target of naval activities in the world. And then, as you see, this is a first iron chain and second iron first iron chain and second iron chain is here. It will be completed by 2040, and this is around 2020. In such a way, China is gradually emerging up as a kind of their own territorial water, something like that. And Japan's orientations. The axis of Japan's maritime policy and Japan-US security alliance have gradually shifted from fight on terrorism toward China's oceanic assertiveness and proactivism in the past decades. And when it put into policy level, emphasis on the maritime security. And this year's Defense of Japan annual report of Ministry of Defense shows strong concern China's activism. And NODA meeting on September 23rd this year decided to strengthen security cooperation, SROC, and then bilateral consultations. And then actual operation is also proceeding and concretizing its maritime policy. There are some other wording, but I just skip it. For example, the South Sudan's dispatch of troops in South Sudan, and then Djibouti is one of the typical example. In that way, Japan tried to project its own power in the sea region. And moreover, Japan is, according to constitution, to have prohibited to have an aircraft carrier. But in reality, Japan is, at the moment, have a sort of helicopter carrier. And Chinese government is saying it is a Japan's airship. And in such a way, Japan is trying to expand its naval powers, but very subtle way. And this is Japan's base in Djibouti. And then India's orientations and policy level, it's a countermeasure toward China. And as you may be knowing, 1991 onward, the Indian government has, especially Prime Minister Rao, has introduced idea of look east policy. And this has been basically economic policy. But in these days, gradually coming into the double meaning. One is trade or economy, other is security. For example, in Japan, India is trying to have a close relation with Japan, Korea, ASEAN countries, Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, BIMSTEC, IOR, ARC, IONS, ONGC, Petro-Vietnam project, and so on. And in actual operation, modernization and expansion, and Blue Navy water is a kind of the war cry, and joint naval exercise with various countries. And this is Gorshkov, the Soviet Union's aircraft carrier, going to be inducted within this year. Now, gradually coming to the final part of my presentation. The Japan and India's challenge. How to shape a common strategy. In Japan, firstly, how to overcome differences between the two. In Japan, some strategists, especially put it very frank way, rightist, they are claiming or they are advocating the idea Japan should have a sort of alliance with India. And especially these days, in the past 2 or 3 years. I said always, it is impossible. India will never accept. And this is what they are responding. New Delhi will be forthcoming in economic partnership, strategic dialogue, but not balancing role to China. India's foreign policy line is strategic partnership. As I mentioned earlier, India's SP is strategic partnership with 20 major countries. In order to not jeopardize its a solid orientation of independence foreign policy. And another point is how to involve United States and ASEAN. The U.S. keen interest in ASEAN region. Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, has written recently, in coming decades, U.S. would put all national powers into Asian Pacific region. And then President Obama is now in Asian region to attend this, the East Asian Summit. And then next one is Quad approach in the framework of tri-bilateral security relations, trilateral high-level meeting, U.S., India, and Japan. And one more, ASEAN's strategic move to cope with China. The ASEAN countries' anxieties, especially the United States is going to reduce the defense expenditure to the level of 500 billion in the coming one decade. And this will put some kind of anxieties to the ASEAN countries. And the economy also, the TPP is going to be soon materialized. And then Vietnam and Malaysia and even Thailand, they are willing to participate in TPP because they fear about China. And then in this sense, what I want to say is holistic approach is necessary, is absolutely necessity. The good chemistry of realism come liberalism. To constrain but not contain, and combination of the hedging and engagement. There is very interesting remarks. When the Prime Minister Kang asked the visiting Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, how India is so successful dealing with China? Please let me know your secret. And then Prime Minister Singh said, first, engagement. Second, deep study. Thirdly, lots of patience. So in such a way, he put the stress, underscore the necessity of the engaging with China. And the India, Japan also should be taking this line. And then how they concretize this idea is hedging partly might be exclusive, expansion of defense capability, and joint naval exercise, bilateral or multilateral, and engagement inclusive or exclusive, institutionalization of maritime security, and Asian regionalism. And this will be a kind of combination, two-way policies to be utilized from now on. Why holistic? And why combination of hedging and engagement? To be effective and sustainable. I should put it very frankly, I'm not against criticizing the China, and I love Chinese everything, and especially Chinese food is marvelous. And then each year I visit China, and they have a very beautiful food and so on. But as far as the policy matter is concerned, it is different talk. I put it my very frank opinion. My idea is crucial challenge for Japan and Indian cooperation is strategic cooperation should be so oriented that it would create Asian environment where China would be find difficult, tough, to become a hegemon, and instead to accept cooperation for regional framework. And then in this way, the cooperation between India and Japan should be oriented. And needless to say, in this framework, U.S. involvement is absolute necessity. It is without the United States, it is impossible to sort of make this kind of framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's go to Dr. Kesavan.
Thank you. Should I bring that one?
You could switch seats if you like. Maybe the easiest way to do this.
Yeah. This one's wrong. Thank you very much. Well, that was a great presentation by my friend, Professor Orimoto. He gave us a very detailed presentation of India-Japan relations, and also he took into account various developments within the continent. So before I actually make my presentation, let me take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this seminar, Woodrow Wilson Center, my dear friend Michael Krugman, who was kind enough to invite me to this seminar. So I consider this as a great honor for me to be here to share my thoughts on this subject. I'm also thankful to Mike for including India as a subject of discussion here. I am sure this India-Japan partnership will catch fire and provoke more people, and also lead to organizing more seminars on this subject, because I think it's a very important subject which affects the future of Asia. It's a major component contributing to the stability and security of the Asian continent. Now, we all know that India and Japan are going to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of the diplomatic relations next year. That is 60 years of the diplomatic relations. And during these 60 years, relations have witnessed a number of ups and downs. Though there have been a number of downs, one should also recognize the fact that there have been strong currents of goodwill and also cooperation from the peoples of both these countries. Understanding. Both countries have had very long historical ties, which created a very strong bond between the two countries. It is not a joke to talk about Buddhism, etc. Now I really realize, after touring very extensively in various parts of Japan, I can understand how much influence Buddhism exerted on the minds of the Japanese people, etc. So I will not go into those details. Suffice it to say that there is a very deep sense of goodwill and also cooperation between the peoples of the two countries. So that has really withstood various ups and downs through these 60 years. Now, during the Cold War period, as Professor Orimoto rightly said, relations were affected by ideology. Ideology created serious barriers to closer understanding and closer cooperation. In spite of that, one should also acknowledge the fact that despite the difficulties created by the Cold War, even then I think the leaders of both these countries were able to find space to develop cooperative relations. For example, economic assistance from Japan to India in 1957-58 itself, which became a major bridge of understanding between the two countries. Of course, India considered US-Japan alliance as unwarranted, as something which abridges the sovereignty of Japan, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the Japanese also considered India's close relations with Soviet Union somewhat unacceptable, and they considered non-alignment as another name for being pro-Soviets. So all these differences were there. Now, the year 2000, in my opinion, is very, very important. 2005 is very important. 2000 also is very important because that prepared the ground for what really happened in 2005. See, 2000, Mr. Modi visited, Prime Minister Modi visited India, and he called upon both Japan and India not to get too much embroiled in their own bilateral problems, and called upon them to launch a global partnership between themselves. So that was really a turning point in our relations. Before that, let us get back a little and then find out what really happened before Modi's visit. In fact, the end of the Cold War opened up new opportunities. 4 important reasons could be cited for injecting a kind of new life into India-Japan partnership. The first one was the adoption of economic liberalization program by India. We all know that until 1991, India actually followed inward-looking economic strategies, emphasizing the need for import substitution, etc., etc. Now, that kind of narrow, restrictive policy came to an end in 1991, and India launched on economic reforms and liberalization. That was really a turning point. For a long time, the Japanese were saying, they were showing their absolute dissatisfaction with the economic strategies adopted by India from 1947 onwards. Therefore, the new economic policy impressed the Japanese very much. Not only that, Indian economy also started making significant progress. Every year, the rate of growth was more than 68%. Consistently, India maintained that growth rate. And exports began to increase. Economic prosperity was really slowly coming to India, and economy was becoming more and more healthy, etc. That really kindled the interest of Japan towards India. And secondly, as Professor Orimoto rightly said, India also adopted multi-dimensional foreign policy in place of non-alignment. So it opened up new opportunities for India. Now India began to look at USA in a different light. Closer understanding was forged between the US and India. The presidents of USA, both Clinton and Bush, visited India at different stages. And soon USA also emerged as the biggest trading partner of India, as well as technology provider for our country. Then ultimately, of course, we also know in 2005, a strategic partnership was forged between the two countries and followed by the civilian nuclear agreement in 2008. All these things were really very positive, and Japanese were really impressed by these developments. Reference was made to India's adoption of Lucky's policy. It's again a major turning point in our foreign policy. India had neglected our immediate neighborhood, namely Southeast Asia, despite our long historical ties with that region for a very long time. So it was our Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, who really wanted to develop our relations with, or restore our relations with Southeast Asia. So he launched on this Lucky's policy, which also included Japan. So he went to Japan in the year 1992, and that was again a very important development in our bilateral relations. And fourthly, China. In recent years, I think both India and Japan, they have shown considerable concerns about the rise of China. How to deal with China? It's a very important question. They meet and discuss it in different forums. But ultimately, I personally feel that both countries realize that their partnership should not be really directed against any third country. Even in 2008, when they signed the declaration on security cooperation, both Prime Minister Aso and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh categorically stated that this declaration is not directed against China. And that's natural, because both India and Japan know that in any scenario of future regional order in Asia, China is going to play an important role. Therefore, it is better to engage China rather than antagonize it. And there are also compelling reasons for them not to antagonize China, because China is the biggest trading partner of both Japan and India. And China has had very deep cultural relations with both Japan and India. Therefore, and moreover, China is a very big neighbor. You can't really close your eyes to the fact that it is going to be your neighbor for the rest of your life. You can't change geography. You can't relocate China to some other continent. Therefore, they are realistic that they have got to live with China. So these four factors are very important in any discussion on India-Japan relations in recent years. I will not go into various security aspects already mentioned by Professor Horimoto. All I would like to say is that the relations since 2000 have become more and more diversified. Earlier, relations were only confined to economic matters like official development assistance or trade or investment. But today, relations really encompass a wide spectrum of subjects like maritime security, energy, climate change, and anti-terrorism and things of that kind. Therefore, the base of our partnership has really broadened. It's become more and more multifaceted, really. Now, after Modi's visit, what did Modi really seek to achieve when he came to India in 2000? First of all, he wanted to redefine the parameters of India-Japan partnership. And moreover, Modi also was looking for new policy options for Japan itself, because by 2000, many things had happened. During the 90s, Japanese were not very sure about what Clinton was trying to do with China. There was a lot of skepticism in the minds of the Japanese about American policy towards Japan. And then came the Southeast Asian currency crisis, when Japan really wanted to make a major initiative, wanted to form an Asiatic, monetary system, monetary fund, and America really discouraged the Japanese from launching on that. Some of these things really disappointed the Japanese. So Japan was trying to put more and more emphasis on ASEAN +3, for example. So they were looking for new options. They are not against the alliance. They are not saying that they are going to, abandon the alliance with the USA. What they were trying to do is they were in a state of confusion. It was very close after the end of the Cold War. What the US would do, how the alliance would shape up in the coming years. Therefore, they wanted new foreign policy options. And they thought that India could be one of the major foreign policy options. So that was set in motion by Mori, that was picked up by his successors like Koizumi and then, Abe, for example. Then came, of course, Aso, then Hatoyama, etc. One or two things I would like to emphasize here in this connection. One is India-Japan partnership has now gone beyond political changes both in Japan and in India. Changes may come, prime ministers may go and come in both countries, but that is not really going to affect the future of the India-Japan partnership. That means it has really become very stable and solidified. The second aspect I would like to emphasize is, on account of the efforts made by leaders of both countries, today you have an elaborate network of institutional mechanisms for taking care of the different aspects of India-Japan partnership. You mentioned any subject, for example, energy, there is a mechanism dealing with energy. Ask about counter-terrorism, there is a mechanism. Security, there is. So you got a very, very vast network of consultative or advisory mechanisms that they have set up. For example, I mentioned earlier the general declaration on joint declaration on security cooperation, followed by an action plan. If you look at the documents, you will find how dialogues have been developed at different levels. The prime ministers of the two countries meet every year. It's unprecedented. I don't think Japan has got a similar arrangement with any other country except perhaps the United States. Foreign ministers are meeting every year. Foreign secretaries are meeting. Chiefs of army staff are meeting. Therefore, we really have been very successful in creating such an elaborate mechanism of consultation at different levels, which I think is a great achievement. This is unthinkable before. See, today, for example, we go to Japan and participate in any discussion on security, you definitely find India being discussed very seriously. 15 years ago, nobody took India seriously in any discussion in Japan. So that is the kind of change that has really taken place in the last about 10 years. Now then of course, maritime security, etc., have already been mentioned. I will not go into all those details. But let me try to touch on the economic aspects of the partnership. See, when you talk about partnership, in my opinion, the major element of the partnership is more economic than security. And I like it that way. I don't want security to overtake economic interests. Today the partnership is solid because we started with the economic aspects and then we developed other aspects. So therefore the foundation is very solid. And that really applies to Japanese foreign policy itself. You all know that for decades Japan really eschewed any involvement in political or military matters. It only concentrated on economic development. That paid off. And similarly, India-Japan partnership also, it started very well, concentrating only on economic matters, and that really provided a solid base for expansion into other areas. This is my feeling. I don't know what Mr. Orimoto will say. So I think our starting point was very good. Our progress is very nice. Now let me talk about one or two other things. See, when you talk about economic partnership, the thing that really comes to our mind is official development assistance, ODA as we all call it. It is a key component of our partnership. In fact, India was the first Asian country to receive Japanese economic aid even as early as in 1957. And since then, the last 50 years, or more than 50 years, Japan has supplied about 28 billion US dollars as economic aid, which is really solid. Now, the terms of ODA also have tremendously improved over decades. In the initial period, of course, people are talking about ODA being tied, etc., etc. ODA was another instrument for Japan to promote its own trade, etc. But those things really are not discussed nowadays. India is the biggest ODA receiver from Japan, particularly from 2003. And here also we have to note one important fact. During 1990s, Japan was the biggest ODA supplier in the whole world. But Japan could not retain that position after 2000. First it yielded to USA, and then other countries like Britain, Germany, France, they overtook Japan. Today Japan is only 5th or 6th aid giver. In other words, it means that Japanese overall aid quantum has been declining in the last several years. But even though the Japanese ODA has been declining in terms of its quantity, Japan's supply to ODA to India has been increasing. It's a very important fact, That shows the significance that Japan attaches to India. Even this year, for example, after this tsunami tragedy in Fukushima, the Japanese government put a number of cuts on its ODA, but it did not really apply those cuts to India. India has been exempted from those restrictions. That means India is getting the same level of aid as last year. So that is the importance that the Japanese government attaches to this partnership, particularly in the area of development assistance. Now ODA, of course, it is becoming more and more complex in Japan. I think my Japanese friends know it very well. ODA is a controversial subject. Japan does not have unlimited strength to continue to give ODA to other countries. Now people are questioning, taxpayers are questioning, why the hell do you really give ODA to countries which you have never seen? We do not know where these countries are. So more and more restriction, more and more pressures are coming from the taxpayers on the question of ODA. Therefore, ODA is now therefore getting more and more limited in quantity, and the question that arises is whether ODA should really be relied upon by India for in the future, when ODA's future itself is under pressure in Japan. Therefore, people say that India should really now graduate to the next stage, should try to reduce the importance of ODA and then try to increase the importance of FDI, that is investment, private investment. Private investment should really replace Japanese official development, and that will be more reliable and more sensible for India to continue its partnership with Japan. Now let me turn my attention to investment. Where investment can really be a substitute for ODA. Now if you look at the quantum of investment that you get from Japan, it is really not much. Excuse me, just 1 minute. Now you see this figure. During 2000 and 2009, September, Japan supplied, that is 9 years, Japanese contribution, investment contribution amounted only to $3.3 billion US, whereas the total quantum was 105 billion that India really received from other countries. So Japan occupies number sixth position in the investment map. The first country is Mauritius, the second is Singapore, third is USA, fourth is UK, fifth is Netherlands.
How do we know that there's not a lot of Japanese funds coming through Mauritius, since that's the tax?
That's true, but we do not know. Officially, these are the figures. I agree with you. Many parts of this investment could come from Mauritius also. That's what the Japanese are claiming. Now, if you look at the investment story, you'll find that when India became independent, in the very first 1 or 2 decades, or even 3 or 4 decades, India pursued a very restrictive policy with regard to foreign investment. It did not really attach any importance to the role of investment as an instrument of development. It discouraged foreign investment, and that continued until 1991. Even though there was some semblance of the government being somewhat receptive to inviting foreign investment in the years 1980s, but that was very, very small. But from 1991 onwards, as part of the liberalization program, the Indian government removed many of the obstacles to the flow of foreign. It really encouraged the entry of foreign investment. But even then, the Japanese investors did not take advantage of the new opportunities given to them after 1991. The Japanese investment continues to be very, very small, and Japanese investment has, of course, flowed into areas such as automobiles, for example. The Japanese are the main part of the investment has gone into areas like automotive industry and electronics, etc., etc. So there are opportunities, and how the Japanese are going to make use of these opportunities, we do not know. Now that takes me to the next part, namely now before I actually take up trade, let me say a few things about the investment climate in Japan itself. Even some of the Japanese institutions like Japan Bank for International Cooperation, they have clearly said the investment climate in India is quite friendly and also receptive. And India can be regarded as a convenient place, a comfortable place for Japanese future investment. Similarly, other reports like UNCTAD reports, for example, for the years 2007-2008, also regard India as a very, very favorable place for foreign investment. But so far, the Japanese really have not taken advantage of this. The reasons, of course, the Japanese are complaining that there are, of course, problems with regard to infrastructure, etc., etc. There are also possibilities of labor unrest. For example, recently the Maruti Suzuki automobile company was severely affected by a prolonged labor strike in their plant. Therefore, there are still problems. The Japanese perception of India being a favorable destination for their investment is still very strong. Second point is, what is the nature of the Japanese investment in India? Still, I think Japanese companies, automobile companies, for example, they go there and then they produce their vehicles only for domestic consumption. The Japanese investment that you find in India is oriented predominantly to domestic consumption. They are not oriented to export promotion, unlike you find Japanese companies in Southeast Asia or in China. They produce the products and then they export back to Japan. Such a thing has not happened in India. Only recently, for example, in places like Chennai, where Nissan has set up an automobile plant, it is going to export part of its products to other countries. Therefore, the Japanese should try to orient their investment for export promotion. I think the strategy should really change in the coming years. Then only they can really take advantage of the present atmosphere in India. Lastly, I think I'll come to trade, bilateral trade. Bilateral trade has remained on a very, very low key, which really reflected which really did not reflect the true potential of India. If you look at the trade figures, you will find that India actually, so Japan only accounts for 13 billion US dollars. That is, India-Japan trade is only amounting to about 13 billion US dollars. Which means that the base of the bilateral trade is still very, very traditional and also very narrow. We have not broadened the base of bilateral trade. We are not really, we are trying to diversify our trade relations. Japan is supplying the same kind of thing which it used to supply in the 1960s, 70s, like for example machinery, transport equipment, or electronic goods, chemicals, and metal products. Whereas India keeps on supplying to Japan only things like tea, for example, or gems and jewelry, and things of that kind. For example, India is, of course, is very strong in software industry. And our supply to Japan is almost very, very small. Japan has not taken advantage of India's skills in the software industry. Japan itself is very rich in that sector and accounts for more than 50 billion in terms of outsourcing. But Japanese outsourcing has not gone to India in any significant manner. So these are some of the areas which I think they have to explore and then try to expand their bilateral trade. So in this connection, I would like to point out that both countries have recently signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. If that is implemented effectively, I think the quantum of trade is bound to increase in the coming years, as it happened in the case of South Korea. So you find there's a real competition going on between Japan and some other countries, including South Korea. South Korea has really overtaken Japan in concluding this comprehensive economic partnership agreement with India. The result is you find India-South Korea trade has overtaken India-Japan bilateral trade. Same thing applies to the question of when Japan and India will sign a civilian nuclear agreement. And that's also going to boost the bilateral trade. Now I understand that the main obstacles for signing that civilian nuclear agreement perhaps have been removed, and by the time the Prime Minister of Japan visits India before December, I think there are bright prospects for having an agreement on this. And if that thing takes place, I think our trade is again likely to go up. Therefore, these are some of the important aspects of bilateral partnership. As I said earlier, to conclude, I would say that partnership has become more diversified. Partnership is no longer economic in character. It has got other elements like security, then energy cooperation in United Nations reforms, and counter-terrorism, maritime security, and all these things. And we have also set up a very significant network of consultative mechanisms to deal with a variety of problems between the two partners. And lastly, I would say this partnership has come to stay, irrespective of the political changes that take place both in India and Japan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now we hear from our final speaker.
Thanks very much, Michael, Bob. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to do this very briskly so that we can really open it up here. And I'd like to start just by telling you that I was living in New Delhi in 2006, writing a dissertation partly about India and partly about Japan, so shuttling between the countries, at a time when this relationship was really breaking open. This was when, as you remember, Shinzo Abe came to power in Tokyo and timed his ascension with the release of this wonderful book in which he said that, in his view, India would basically overtake the United States as Japan's most important partner within the coming decade. So this was really bracing stuff at the time. It's sort of slipped off the agenda in some ways, just given all of the news out of Asia and elsewhere over the previous 5 years. But in fact, I would argue that this is one of the most exciting long-term strategic developments that you're seeing in this region. I would go so far as to argue that if this works, and I think it does, this partnership, as kind of a shaping structure for this wider Indo-Pacific region, that India-Japan partnership will be as important as China's rise in determining the future of this very wide region and in turn the future nature of the international system. We've covered a lot of this already, but there's a natural convergence of Japanese and Indian interests in this region in maintaining equilibrium, in sustaining sea lane security, in defeating terrorism, in maintaining a liberal economic order that is not closed around the Chinese economy, but that is open and kind of pan-regional. So there's this extraordinary economic and strategic convergence, which is why I think many of us are quite optimistic in the long term about this relationship. India is clearly rising. Japan is clearly investing in India in many ways. It raises an interesting set of questions about India's interests in Japan. This is very interesting in the debate about the quote-unquote decline of the United States, because our Indian friends are pretty explicit in saying, look, we've actually reoriented our foreign policy around this breakthrough to the West, to you, that we've seen unfold over the last decade. We've had this great debate in India over our external orientation. Do you really think we would have gone to all this trouble to build this new partnership with the United States if we thought that you were in terminal decline? We're making a bet on you and U.S. staying power in the international system. In a similar way, I would argue that perhaps India is making a bet on Japan, and perhaps the narrative of Japanese decline has also been oversold. So I'm very interested in this. I'm not going to spend more time on it, but in this question of kind of perceptions out of Delhi, and the world really perhaps does look a little different than it does to those of us in the West. A long-term U.S. goal, certainly for the past 15 years, has been transforming the U.S.-Japan alliance out of this Cold War model in which Japan was basically sheltered in a cocoon, was a rather inactive security partner in some respects. Starting from the Joint Declaration in 1996, if not earlier, U.S. administrations of various hues really began a concerted push to pull Japan into becoming a regional and in the 2000s a global security provider. I mean, it's very interesting. We've all had our chronologies of this India-Japan relationship today. But it's very interesting just to run through how Japan really has metamorphosized from being a sort of passive ally of the U.S. To one that has gone from deploying forces extra-regionally in the Indian Ocean around the Afghan conflict, non-combat forces in Iraq, the anti-piracy operations, to the point where the U.S.-Japan alliance has really become multilateralized, right? And we saw this in 2005 when the U.S.-Japan formally agreed to exercise with third countries in quite a fundamentally different way. We saw, obviously, the formation of the Quad and other exercises and institutions. We saw Japan for the first time in 2007 break out of this bilateral relationship with the U.S. on security and forge this very interesting partnership with Australia. The following year, 2008, we saw this joint declaration on security cooperation between Japan and India. And my thesis would be, of course, India is strategically autonomous, independent, and always will be. Will never do what any country suggests that it does. But in fact, Japan followed the U.S. lead as a result of our big breakthrough with India in 2005, the defense and civil nuclear agreements, to go ahead and kind of seize the strategic space and imprimatur to forge a new relationship with India bilaterally, as well as we've seen with Australia. So as we've looked back over the last 10 years at the way U.S. strategy in this region has shifted. We've also seen a set of parallel shifts. And again, these don't particularly mean that countries are following us or taking any signals from Washington, but in fact, we're all responding to the same set of regional systemic imperatives to deepen cooperation in the shadow of China's rise, in the presence of new security threats. And so, in fact, we've really seen something quite different emerge. And Japan and India are really at the center of this, to the point where here we are, the three countries are about to sit down in a trilateral for the first time at the Track 1 level. So, what is the logic of this relationship from Japan? I think it's pretty clear. Economically, Japan very interested in diversifying away from China, looking at India the way many Japanese companies looked at China in the 90s as China opened up as this vast source of manpower, these extraordinary Indian requirements for infrastructure. Biggest foreign investment in India is the Delhi-Mumbai rail corridor that Japan is building, financing and building. The countries are very complementary economically. There's also an extraordinary Japanese interest in resource security and sea lane security. The Indian Ocean sea lanes carry so much of Japan's energy resources from Central Asia and the Gulf, and there's an obvious congruence of interests. Japan still has a rather capable navy. People tend to forget. A very obvious naval dimension to the partnership. There's also, quite interestingly, I think our Indian friends and our Japanese friends perhaps talk about this a bit differently than we do. But I would argue, there are a lot of voices in India, so you get all opinions out of India. But I would argue that the kind of dominant strain is one that, like in Japan, would like to reinforce a liberal order in Asia that is not Sino-centric, that remains open, that remains full of strategic space for countries like India to rise in. Right? And Japan has a similar set of aims. You saw how Japan in 2005 worked quite concertedly to pull India into the East Asia Summit so that club did not become Sino-centric. Here we are in 2011. We're about to have the next East Asia Summit, and not only is India in there with Japan and everybody in Asia, but the United States and Russia are too. So this has been a diplomatic success story. But the point I would maintain is that both countries in different ways are actually interested in kind of reinforcing the basic structure of an open region, rather than trying to revise that order in directions that are less favorable, certainly to us in the United States. I would argue that, in fact, that's why their cooperation is actually in the long term quite favorable to U.S. interests. Final thing to say about Japan is just how interesting it was. Again, we can debate this, but from the U.S. perspective, I was just coming out of government at the time. But the Hatayama administration was a disaster in the eyes of many people who were managing the relationship on the U.S. side. And there was a period before he fell when it looked like Japan was really fundamentally revising its most basic tenets of foreign policy principles around the U.S. alliance, around China, around a different sort of Asian community, right? There was one thing that was a constant under Prime Minister Hatayama, which was that he continued to move the Japan-India relationship forward, visiting India at a time when he was really under fire domestically at home. The U.S.-Japan alliance was on life support, et cetera, et cetera. But the one foreign policy consistency that he showed, really, was to continue moving forward this Japan-India relationship. And I think we thought that was quite interesting and revealing in terms of Japan's long-term intentions, irrespective of party in power. For India, the perspective from Delhi is as we in the U.S. community see it. India, of course, has an interest in transcending the subcontinent, right? It was sort of stuck there. It was stuck in this subcontinental box for a long time by virtue of its own decisions and by the structure of the Cold War. The proliferation debates over the 90s. Our read is that India is very keen on breaking out of this subcontinental box and becoming a wider Asian power, which of course historically it has been. This has led to this very interesting foreign policy reorientation in India that has led India to prioritize building a deeper set of partnerships with many of our friends in Asia. India is doing this for its own reasons. Countries like Japan, Australia are intrinsically important. They're not important because they're U.S. allies. But the point is that India's look east and act east diplomacy has actually reinforced a lot of what we would like to see in terms of closer relations between security partners for us like India and old allies like Japan. We haven't talked about it. I'm surprised it hasn't really come up. But this very important point that India and Japan don't have history issues, right? So there isn't a set of historical baggage that Japan brings to the table when it sits down to have these conversations with Indian counterparts. As a result, people-to-people perceptions are actually quite strong countries. The people of both countries regard each other rather highly. Both see opportunities for the other in a closer partnership. Another part of India's strategic shift over the last 10 years has been this reorientation. It's not just from the subcontinent to this wider Asian and global sphere, but it's also about this shift from kind of historically being a land power to being kind of a maritime power, right? As India's strategic horizons have expanded, as it's looked at the opportunities out there, as it's looked to expand its economic relationships in the developing world and in the West, as it's looked to deepen partnership with Japan and other developed economies of Northeast Asia. Increasingly, Indian interests in many of these realms revolve around the maritime domain rather than the old land domain in which, India and Pakistan were hyphenated, and India and China had their border conflict. Those countries haven't gone away. But I would argue that as India's strategic horizons have expanded, it's increasingly been impelled to act more fully in this maritime space that links it to Japan. And of course, finally, Japan has a great set of technologies, capital to offer India, as I mentioned earlier. And much of Indian statecraft really can be understood as an effort to crack open access to many of these technologies that India has been denied for a long time. Just to finish up, what are the wider implications for the U.S.? I mean, again, I think we spent a lot of time talking about this bilateral dimension. From our perspective, we're very interested in moving this region, we, the U.S. policy community, we're very interested in moving beyond the old hub and spokes model in Asia. Obviously, we're very interested in these new networks that are being constructed, building in countries that weren't part of our traditional alliance network, like India, into a broader set of security partnerships, abandoning our monopoly, which we really had because many Asian countries were weak. As they become stronger, we're happy to abandon the monopoly that we had in terms of relations between countries like Japan and Korea or Japan and Australia. Rather than trying to keep our allies apart, as arguably we did for 50 years during the Cold War, we've increasingly tried to encourage them to come together. And in this realm, we're just really excited by the diplomacy that we've seen coming out of both Tokyo and New Delhi. It's very interesting on these new networks. I was in Australia on a speaking tour just a month ago, and there was a wonderful interview with Tony Abbott, who at the time was really 2-1 as the opposition leader in the polls against the current Australian Prime Minister. And he was asked, what would your foreign policy priorities be? What would you do differently when you're Prime Minister, not if, when? And his answer, very interesting. The first was on Tibet and the Dalai Lama and being more serious about that as an issue. And his second was on reinstating the Quad with India, Japan, and the United States. So, I take the point that we've all been working at this in different ways, but it was very interesting to hear that from the potential future leader of the country that Willie was responsible for walking back from the Quad. Finally, the last thing I would say is simply for anybody who would argue, and I'd be happy to take on the argument that somehow Japan and India and the U.S. are working to construct some sort of containment coalition against China. I would maintain that if China really is interested in having a peaceful rise and is really interested in another 30 peaceful years of development in a rather secure regional order, then that is more likely to occur if countries in the region are strong and prosperous and enjoy deepened partnerships with each other, rather than if they were weak and divided and creating a vacuum that China might be encouraged to fill through external adventurism. So that is to say that to the extent that there's any kind of imperial temptation in Beijing, I would argue that a strong Japan-India relationship will be at the core of encouraging China's better instincts, and that at the end of the day is actually a better outcome for China. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks to the three of you. We're going to open it up in just a minute, but let me just ask the first question and perhaps play the devil's advocate a bit. We've heard a lot of reasons why India and Japan are destined to draw closer together, given all the shared interests, lack of historical baggage, and the like, but very few relationships don't have challenges or possible constraints or obstacles. Are there any possible scenarios or obstacles, constraints that could arise that could conceivably cause problems or some disagreements for these two countries? Or is it all good? For anyone.
Yes, senior most.
Oh. Well, I think China could really pose a challenge to us because opinion on China is very sharply divided. As I said in my presentation, I think both India and Japan should not really direct that partnership against any third country, including China. But within India itself, again, I don't know about Japan, within India itself there are tremendous pressures. Politicians are putting pressures, business people are talking about it. I think that could really be one challenge to the partnership. What exactly we are going to, how we exactly are going to deal with China. So that is really going to be a major, dilemma for the partnership.
Can I just do a two-sentence answer, which is that both India and Japan have world-class bureaucracies, right? And we've seen this even in this question of when do we schedule this new U.S., Japan, India trilateral. People can correct me, but the latest I heard is that there's a spat within the Indian MEA over which division in the MEA will get to control this trilateral. And as a result, this thing has been postponed several times. So the U.S. certainly has our own bureaucracy, but I would say that just kind of navigating between these bureaucracies is going to be an extraordinary challenge.
Which is the case with many relationships, alas. We're going to start taking questions, and I just ask that you wait until the microphone arrives before you ask the question. Please try to keep it brief and make it one question, not four. So we'll start right here, right up in the front.
I'm Bob Hathaway here at the Wilson Center. Kudos and congratulations to all three speakers for really very interesting and informative presentations. Michael took a question that I was formulating, but I didn't hear any of the answers that I thought I might hear to Michael's question. So let me put three specific issues on the table that might be difficult issues for the emerging India-Japan relationship and invite any of you to talk about any of the three. One would be climate change. A second would be issues having to do with non-proliferation and or world disarmament. A third would be the set of international trade and economic issues being discussed among other places at what used to be the Doha round. I'm not sure whether there is a Doha round. But would any of the three of you care to look into the future of this bilateral relationship with respect to any or all of these three issues?
Very, very interesting question. And you just pointing out a sort of basic question to be tackled by both of the country. And my idea is that climate change and non-proliferation, international trade, these are the topics to be sorted out in the course of time, gradually. But this idea is basically there's a kind of the conflict between India and Japan, that in international system. I mean to say that, put it very simple way, that India is a revisionist power in the international system, whereas Japan is a status quo power. At the moment, there is a sort of surrounding circumstances that compel them to get together. But in the course of time, I don't think Japan-India could keep this kind of heightened relationship forever. So how this kind of climate change, non-proliferation is going to change is, related to the basic sort of scenario, basic move, how it will be related. I think this is closely connected with that kind of things. And one thing particularly about non-proliferation, concretely, at the moment, Japanese government is going to, at August 5th of this year, declared that we will try to decrease the atomic power generation, but we will export. Export. So in such a way, just gradually a kind of the moralistic stances of Japanese government and then practical Japanese government stances are somehow very complicated. And Mr. Takeuchi is very specialist on this field. He may give you much more good answer to this.
Actually, why don't you wait for the microphone? There's one over here.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hathaway's question is just I'd like to know, but in terms of the Horimoto-san's point, it's very, very still controversial, among in Japan, and among Japanese, in particular, government and media and other, academicians, and so then some people criticize that Japan keep the nuclear equipment to developing countries, including India. It is still controversial, and it criticized as a double standard because Japan itself in domestic market it will decrease the dependence on nuclear power generation. But India's issue is one more that is it's out of NPT regime. So Japan has a different stand from U.S. and the U.S. Provided a special status for India, and that is a great diplomatic game of in India and the U.S. and so now it's already 9 countries, including South Korea. India has a nuclear agreement, cooperation agreement, and so next. Japan. So what shall we do? What shall Japan do? So that is I try to ask Mr. Horimoto or Mr. Twining's idea. I'd like to ask, and also Mr. Kesaban. I'd like to ask.
My question is about the dilemma that the Japanese government is facing now with regard to its own energy policy. See, on the one hand, people like Prime Minister Khan and then others have said that we are not going to really, exploit nuclear energy, and we will turn our attention to other sources. Now, what are the other sources? Are they really going to be a substitute for nuclear energy? Because nuclear energy is now accounting for about 30% of the electricity that we are generating. If you are really going to resort to other sources, are they going to pollute the atmosphere? If they are going to pollute the atmosphere, what about your stand on climate change itself? And similarly, are you not contradicting yourself by saying that we will not have generators, reactors within Japan, but we will export reactors to other countries? So therefore, I think I find there's a lot of confusion in the Japanese government circles as to what exactly what approach they are going to pursue in the coming years. And about the commitment to climate change, is it going to be relaxed in the coming years?
Okay, let's take a question right here.
So I'd like to segue from nuclear right into space, since it touches on energy. There was no discussion. Both India and Japan are space powers, and there was no discussion on potential space cooperation. And I wanted to ask about something that's timely this week. So just yesterday, the International Academy of Astronautics, which is chaired by former ISRO Chairman Nair, released its report on space-based solar power, which is something that has been championed by Dr. Rajagopalan at ORF. as well as Dr. APJ Kalam, and recently the CFR Aspen report called for a joint U.S.-Indian look at the feasibility of something that is one of Japan's 9 space goals. So I think Japan is the only country in the world that currently has articulated space-based solar power as one of its space goals, but clearly something that has had the attention of India's former head of state, and is something that is being talked about by two of our premier think tanks and the ORF. I'm curious if there's been any discussion between Japan and India on potential cooperation on space-based solar power.
There are serious talks about cooperation. Hmm? But I can't really, I mean, I do not know the details of the kind of cooperation that they have. But on paper, they are saying that already, there are programs, and then they are trying to cooperate in the space field, etc., etc. That's what I think.
Let me ask a few words. 4 or 5 years ago, Japan's space organization called JAXA, and then India's space organization called ISRO, has made a sort of basic agreement on cooperating to produce the various technical exchange and so on. And then, as far as I know, in the initial period of this cooperation, I was a bit associated with that. And as far as I know, that their cooperation is going quite well. But at the same time, India wants to have own technology to launch by itself, rather than depending on Japan technology. And so that they can, space development is a kind of market as of now. So that's why, at the moment, it will be all right. But from now on, the competition for the rocket launching and others, orbit and so on, is becoming more expensive and more costly, at the same time, more sort of beneficial. So in that sense, I am not sure how this cooperation between two organizations are taking place. I am not sure.
I'm not sure that I made mine, because it's a topic that most people don't understand. Space-based solar power is articulated in Japan's basic space plan as a potential replacement for nuclear energy, that this is large orbital power stations that would be beaming power via microwaves or lasers to the ground. And this is in fact, Professor Kaya from Kobe University was just here for the press release yesterday. So, I mean, this is potentially large-scale energy for all of humanity. Seems like a potential place where there could be a more visionary cooperation beside low-level.
I'm sorry, I don't know about that aspect.
I would just add, this is a different point, but I would add missile defense to the aspirational agenda in space. I mean, there are few countries that come to mind that are more threatened by ballistic missiles than India and Japan. Japan and the U.S. are so joined up on ballistic missile defense. Japan is having a very lively debate about moving beyond its export ban on technologies associated with some of these things. This, again, is aspirational, perhaps not near term, but I think it should be on the agenda.
Okay, right here.
Thank you. I think nearly all speakers talked about Indian-Japanese cooperation for maritime security, pointing out they had common interests and so on. And I wonder how far this has gone, or how far you think it will go. After all, Japan has its particular problems with China in the East China Sea, and obviously with the disputed Senkaku. India has recently found itself sort of under criticism from China because of Indian part exploration, and also an Indian vessel passing near Vietnam, where the Chinese claimed it was near their territorial waters. Japan has been seeking to work with the Philippines also on things to do with the South China Sea. Now this raises the prospect of India and Japan somehow working together on maritime security in ways that would seem at least from Beijing, to be aimed at Beijing. So how can one separate the ideal of not working against a third party with work on maritime security?
That's a great question. I don't mean to give a flip answer. I mean, this is a serious answer. China doesn't have an Indian Ocean coastline. So if two countries decide to undertake joint exercises in the Indian Ocean, I'm not sure why it's any particular concern of China's. China's claim to the entirety of the South China Sea is also rather widely recognized to be invalid. So I'm also not sure why Japanese and Indian kind of individual efforts to create an open space in the South China Sea would be threatening. China did object to Indian and Japanese naval exercises that took place in the Western Pacific to the east of Okinawa. And I mean, my view on this is just that it really reveals the extent of China's ambitions, that it's protesting things that are occurring quite far from its shores, right?
I got the impression, as I made explanation in this slide, last month there was the first India-Japan maritime security dialogue has been conducted. And from the Japanese side and as well the Indian side, they are all military people, retired people. And then what happened, what I got the impression was the military people, generally speaking, as everywhere, tend to put stress on the threat of China. Whereas foreign affairs people try to, the constructive, try to keep engagement and so on. I think there is this kind of the perception gap between within any countries. So for example, when I talk to the MOFA, Minister of Foreign Affairs officials, they try to be more accommodative. But people from this defense, Ministry of Defense, they try to, expand or to fortify its defense power and so on. So depending upon which foot forward people standing, the perception toward China is completely different. And in Japan's case also, there may be some two professors, experts here in this conference. There may be some different opinions, but as far as my understanding goes, this is a kind of basic sort of the discrepancies within the country to how to cope with China. And then this is beside another aspect is rightist and leftist and this kind of things are there. But as far as in the ministerial, government level, I think there is such kind of the discrepancy of the perceptions toward China. That makes a big sense.
See, there are two or three other aspects. For example, China and Japan, of course, India and Japan, they cooperate against piracy, for example. China is not involved in that. So they are fighting piracy in open seas. Number two, they have also cooperated in the case of Malacca Strait, for example, to make it more navigable and things of that kind. Again, that's part of maritime security, but it's not direct against China. Now, with regard to Vietnam, of course, recently I think I saw a joint statement made by Japanese Prime Minister and the visiting Vietnamese Prime Minister. They have talked about the need for ensuring freedom of navigation. It does not mean that it's directed, against the Chinese. Similarly, I think the statement made by Secretary Clinton, for example, 2 years ago, about freedom of navigation, it's not necessarily directed against China. It is a general statement out of concern to ensure the safety of the freedom of navigation. So I think as far as India is concerned, as I said earlier, I think India really tries to avoid provoking China. For example, with Vietnam, it has got certain rights to explore the oil resources off the coast of Vietnam. This was signed long time ago, and now India is going there to do that. But how does it really violate, the rights of the Chinese? That is not Chinese, water.
Okay, right back there.
Stanley Kober. I find this discussion I just have to disagree with Bob. I find it somewhat bizarre. Talk about alliances in Asia. We had an alliance in Asia. It was called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. What happened to it? It disappeared. We did not have the staying power. Look at what's happening in our economy now. We're facing budget cuts that will affect defense. The super committee probably will not reach an agreement, at least that's the buzz. Secretary Panetta, I'm reading this article here, says the consequences of this, they have, he wrote a letter, but it said it could affect the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, canceled. Army's new ground combat vehicle, canceled. The missile defense shield in Europe, canceled. So much for the missile defense cooperation. With regard to the Indian economy, I have another article here. Somebody who used to be with the Bank of India, central bank, says the deterioration with the IMF, the deterioration in India's macro situation is gathering speed. And he goes on, but I'll leave it at that. We have this impression that this is a sort of like normal economic situation and war. And maybe that is the most serious problem confronting all of us. I mean, Japan is more well known, so I've left it out. And we should be working together. I just find this division of the world in these circumstances to be very unrealistic in its assessment of the global situation.
Okay, it's a good point. Let's go to the back, all the way in the back. Nobu.
Nobu Fukuda, scholar at the Wilson Center. What is missing from the ever closer relationship between India and Japan seem to be elements of democracy. I mean, Japan and India are long-established democracies in Asia, and both governments have participated in a number of multilateral efforts at democracy promotion, such as the Community of Democracies, or the United Nations Democracy Fund, or the Global Democracy Initiative that India launched with the United States in 2005. Given those facts, it seems rather odd to me that both prime ministers didn't touch on, I mean, either democracy or democratization in the region in the 2008 joint declaration. I mean, could I invite comments from the panel on why they have been inactive, I mean, in bilateral efforts, I mean, in pushing for democracy in Asia, in the region?
I share the opinion with you. And then these days I'm propagating an idea that, so-called Washington Consensus and at the end of 1980s, that has been unsuccessful. And what happened next turn was the Beijing Consensus. And that has been also failed, especially in North Africa and Middle East. And then this is a turn for the India to be called as India's model, India model. I mean to say that China model is applicable only in case of China. But whereas India's democracy and development could be applicable to anywhere. In some sense, I am saying that the democracy is a kind of keyword to be propagated among everywhere. But when it comes to a realistic point of view, the situation is completely changed. As we discussed in this session, that this Prime Minister Singh is very cautious. This, for example, Joint Security Declaration 2008. This is not against any third country, and very particular about that. And then whenever there is a kind of joint declaration, joint statement produced by India and Japan, always there is a sort of the stereotype phrase, not against China. This is no mention about China. not against the third country. This is the way that Japan and India is reacting to the China's foreign policy or diplomacies. So in that sense, if the Japan and India is start crying for the democracy to be propagated, democracy to be built up, then what will happen will be this indirectly attacking, critical towards China. That's why I am sure that they are not putting forward this kind of idea in the past, say, 2 or 3 years.
Before we move on, I may have been a bit abrupt before. Did any of the three of you want to respond to that question from Stanley Cobra before? I think it may deserve some. Yeah.
I think it was a good point. I mean, Hillary Clinton had his famous piece in Foreign Policy about this very ambitious agenda, and they asked me to write a response, and I wrote what you said, which is you can't do this if you cut defense spending by $1 trillion. It just doesn't work. So good articles and good speeches sort of matter, but of course we have these problems. I mean, this takes us into a different line of comment, but I mean, just to finish up, Nouriel Roubini, who's been the original Dr. Doom around the financial crisis that's been roiling the West for the last 3 years, had a very interesting piece yesterday, and I think the Wall Street Journal, in which he said, this is the first time I've ever seen him say anything positive. He said, look at the economic problems of the United States, Europe, and China. Bet on the U.S. So, I mean, we managed a 40-year Cold War. We fought a civil war. Our politics have still managed to resolve fundamental structural crises to American society and our role in the world. And I would like to be optimistic and assume that our politics will resolve this one. Mitt Romney has pledged to increase ship procurement, as you know, from 9 to 15 every year, which is a message that goes over very well in Asia.
Okay, all the way in the back, the gentleman right in front of you, Joshua.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. My name is Mohsen Dingankar. Horimoto Sensei, you mentioned a case of India hedging and engaging with China. However, over the last few years, it is very difficult to talk of any issues that India and China have found common ground on, irrespective of Doha round or climate change negotiations. The differences between India and China have expanded massively to the point that I think the relationship is now at its worst point in quite a few years. And this is despite of increasing trade. Now, India has recently indicated a reorientation of its defense policy by moving troops to the eastern border with China and also BrahMos missiles jointly developed with Russia. Do you see this as an Indian move, independent Indian move, breaking out of the hedging and engaging role against a more confrontationist role against China, irrespective of the US, India, Japan trilateral? Telling China that we are not going to be taking it, the way we've been taking it in the past, more confrontation.
Recently, I wrote an article. It's about Indo-China relations, and the same subtitle was ambivalent relationship. Ambivalent relationship. I mean to say, in the one side, it's very positive and very sort of forthcoming, but at the same time, in the other field, that is very negative. As far as positive side is concerned, it is trade, economy, export. And 2014, the sort of bilateral trade is going to up to 10 billion. 10 billion? No, 100 billion. 100 billion. And then this is a sort of big factor. Both of the country, especially India, is trying to do. But at the same time, the climate change is a very subtle point. At the moment, it is most of the country trying to go common way, common strategy. But when you see the inside of this climate change, there is a subtle change, subtle difference between the two countries. So in that way, at the moment, India is not only depending upon the hedging, but at the same time engagement. I should say engagement comes first, and then at the same time hedging. So in that way, the Indian government is taking this kind of policy line to maximize its foreign policy points. That's what I thought.
See, many in India are saying that too much of engagement also is taken as a sign of weakness. In fact, if you look at India's policy, official policy toward China, you will find that there is an element of, trying to not provoke the Chinese too much. I think they are too patient. I think their reaction is not really natural. I think sometimes they have got to, react rather strongly, as the Chinese do always against India. So I think edging should really become more effective. This is what I feel. Many people in India feel that way. Engagement is okay. We have been engaging China for a long time. The Chinese, every time they take our policy engagement as a sign of weakness. That's the problem.
May I say a bit more? You may be knowing land dispute called Senkaku Island. And then 2 or 3 years ago, until that time, this Coast Guard has deployed ships always, 24 hours. And then what happened was, because not to offend the Chinese government, the Japanese government withdrew that the Coast Guard ship. And because of that, there comes sudden proactive Chinese move has gradually happening. If there is a Coast Guard ship 24 hours, then I don't think there is such big incident or accident would be happen. No one knows about this. Only a few limited circle of people know that. I mean to say that in such a way that my contention is the necessary things should be done. Not to afraid, not to offend. Always people in thinking in terms of offending or bad thing or something like that. The government should do what they should do. Otherwise, the situation will not change at all. I am not a so-called hoax, but this is my sort of, my own idea about the foreign policies.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question, so why don't we bring it right up here to the front.
I'm Ray Vickery from the Albright Stonebridge Group. As some know, I'm a big believer in economic engagement as being a driver in terms of the ability of nations to cooperate strategically. And when I hear a number like India-Japan trade only being $12 billion, compared to about 100 million for the U.S., about 100 billion for China. And then I hear that, well, the plan in order to increase this will be in regard to civil nuclear, which seems to be dead in the water, certainly is in a U.S.-India context because of liability concerns. And you've pointed out the great ambivalence in Japan now about civil nuclear. I'm just wondering, this goes back to Bob's third point, in terms of trade and investment, what is going to happen that's going to change the picture between Japan and India to make the economic engagement a driver in the relationship, as opposed to something which is really very tangential, non-consequential for either party right now?
No, what I'm saying is the potential has not been fully tapped, the volume of trade between the two countries is so small, just $12 billion US. Even South Korea is having more than that. So one way is, of course, I also referred to the signing of this comprehensive economic, partnership agreement, CEPA. I think once that comes into active, effect, I think definitely the volume will increase. That's what I feel, because tariffs will be removed in a number of items. I think in the next 3 or 4 years, the volume will definitely go up. In the meantime, of course, the Japanese are also interested in selling the reactors, because they themselves want, their own economy is also in trouble. So they are also interested in selling reactors. They are also, you see, a lot of competition. For example, South Koreans have already signed a agreement with India, and they are going to sell reactors to India. Therefore, to what extent Japan is going to use all these opportunities, this is what I was trying to say. These are only two instances. There are other avenues also for increasing trade.
In my case, I've got a bit different opinions. About Indo-China relations, the 2019 to 1992, the Prime Minister Rao went to China, and then what happened was they shelved land dispute, and instead of that, they expand trade between two countries, and then this basic line is still continued today, even though there is a conflict and tension and this kind of things happens. But basically, they maintained economic as a major factor to proceed to promote bilateral relations. And then in India's Japan's relations, as Professor Keshavan said, SEPA at the moment bilateral trade is about 11 billion. $11 billion. And then it will go up to the 25 billion by 2014. So in such a way, it is gradually go up. So I mean to say that these days, almost every country, as you may be, of course, you may be knowing that every country has facing a kind of economic crisis, and then this will go a long way to improve the future economic situations in domestic field. So I think economy is very, very important. And moreover, if I put to say that quite recently, this Pakistani government has decided to extend the most favored nation status to India. It's a big, huge news for me. And then this will naturally, the expand the trade between two countries, and then naturally, gradually, this economic expansion, trade, will make in the Pakistani society a so-called the financial circles, business circles. They will push the government to democratize, to avoid confronting with India. So in that way, India is also same. India is also very huge, the financial, business circles. For example, Tata, in case of Tata, Tata's annual income is 5% of India's GDP. It is clearly mentioned in Tata's homepage. So, and for example, Reliance included, it will become 10%. In such a way, this business circle has a sort of hidden influence towards the government policies. Likewise, in Pakistan's case also. So, in that sense, the MFF will be a long way to improve the bilateral relationship. And coming to the original point that the economy is very important, very, very important. That's what I wanted to say.
Dan, did you want to make a final? No, okay. All right, well, this has been a very interesting discussion. I think we've all learned a lot this afternoon, but we promised to get you out of here at 5:30, and I think it's 5:32. So if you could all join me in a round of applause for our speakers.